My father had met my mother in Chitose during the Korean War, and they got married and they got transferred to Hachinohe where I was born and returned to Sapporo. And then, because he was still in the US Army, a lot of travel.
I want to welcome someone whose daughter I taught. She's 30 now, but I taught her when she was about 4 years old, years ago, here at this club. Ray, I want to welcome you here this morning. You talked to me about the one I did with Tim Connor, and we started talking then. And my approach to most people on this podcast is, if you like what I'm doing, I want you on.
Okay.
So you're visiting here in Japan now, right?
That's correct.
Where were you born?
In a seaport city called Hachinohe, in the prefecture of Aomori, in the region called Tohoku in northern Japan.
Wow, I drive there all the time on my motorcycle.
Oh, yes.
I go down Maui, and then I go across to go to Hakodate, and then ride do all of Hokkaido all the way up to Wakanai. Okay, so did you live there most of your life as a child?
I spent only maybe a few months in Hachinohe.
Okay.
And the reason I was born in Hachinohe was because my father was in the 1st Cavalry Division during the Korean War, and he was stationed at Camp Hagen, which is in Hachinohe, which is no longer there, a Jieitai or Japanese Self-Defense Forces camp now. Right. It predates Misawa Air Force Base. Yeah.
Wait just a minute, your father's American?
Yes.
But he's Japanese American?
Yes, all the above, because my grandparents, my father's parents, arrived on Maui in 1899.
Did they suffer the concentration camp? I mean the camps?
Because my father, yes, because he was born on Maui, but he was raised in Kumamoto Prefecture as a kid to be educated there, and then came back to Maui during the early 30s. So he graduated from Maui High School in 1937, and a couple of years later, he was obsessed by cars, and he went to Detroit to study auto engineering.
At what age?
Well, he was in his mid-20s, and it was bad timing. It was just before Pearl Harbor.
But he was there. He was in Detroit.
Yes.
So he didn't have to go into the concentration camp.
Yes and no. The day after Pearl Harbor, 2 FBI agents were knocking at his door at his boarding house.
In Chicago?
No, in Detroit.
Detroit,
Yes. And they knew everything that he was doing. And he was allowed to finish his school to the spring of 1942, right? So December 7, 1941. But he was allowed to remain there because, of course, he was not on the West Coast. Right. He was not a spy or anything happening on a port city like San Francisco or Seattle or San Diego. And then, of course, he couldn't go to a relocation camp because they hadn't constructed it yet. So he arrived there when it was constructed to Jerome, Arkansas. Wow. And there were 2 camps, Rower and Jerome.
In Arkansas, they had a camp?
Yes,
I thought they were all on the West Coast.
No, they were. You're correct that they were inland. There were places in Minidoka, Idaho, Gila River, Arizona, Tule Lake, which I think in California, Manzanar, California. So, and I think one in Colorado, but the one most inland was in Arkansas.
Wait, you are really? Are you the only child?
No, I have a sister.
Okay, are you the first?
Yes.
And how many years difference between you?
About
and your
5 years, because I lost a sister in between.
Okay.
Yeah,
were you and your sister close?
I would say we are very close now, much closer now.
But not as a child.
Not as children because of the age gap.
That's right.
When I went to college, she was still 12 years old. Yeah.
Right. You were born in Hachinohe, not in Hachinohe, right?
Right.
And then you stayed there for how long, and then you moved?
Just several months, and then we returned to Sapporo, where the base was outside Chitose, as you know, was a major base until the early 70s. So my father had met my mother in Chitose during the Korean War, and they got married and they got transferred to Hachinohe where I was born and returned to Sapporo. And then because he was still in the U.S. Army, a lot of travel. And then we were in Virginia at Fort Eustis and Newport News, and then in Hawaii for a little bit, Schofield Barracks.
What do you start to remember? What parts do you remember?
I remember Hawaii maybe when I was 5 years old, 4 or 5 years old, and then swimming in the Chesapeake Bay, I remember clearly, and first grade in Virginia. But the clearest memories of Japan is that we spent several years in the early 60s in Yokohama during the Tokyo Olympics. Yeah, so I know Yokohama and Tokyo of that time. And people don't realize that the whole city changed because of the Olympics. I saw some kind of newscast. The monorail has opened.
That's right.
Yeah,
And
it's still there.
That's right. That's
From
right.
63 or 4. Teikoku Hotel, Imperial Hotel, very big center. New Otani opened up. Okura, and before there were just inns and small hotels.
The landscape was very low. I mean, the horizon was very low.
Yeah, and all kinds of
because it was just right after
Yoyogi
the war,
Stadium.
and right after the war, they're still recuperating from that.
Correct, and it was first Olympics in Asia.
That's right.
Yeah,
1964.
and it showed that Japan had climbed out of the devastation of World War II.
That's
You're
right.
But I remember a banana was a big rarity for local Japanese. And
how old were you at that time?
About 10 years old.
10 years old.
But we were living off the base, but I still went into Yokosuka, and I was going to school, Kenneck School at that point, which is a school still there. So I remember the disparity, the PX and so forth, and we were living in a local neighborhood, and my friends, Japanese friends, would tell me of eating whale meat.
Right, of
for
course.
lunch.
Yes.
It was very much a third world country
right.
at that point, even then.
Yes.
And the yen was 360 to $1.
So when did you start? That's right. That's right. You just missed the 410 prior to that. What was it like for you? You knew that you were advantaged. I mean, you started knowing you were advantaged, and you were an American.
Right.
But you had Japanese nationality too? Did
No,
you have both?
never.
Never. You've never had
because at that time, at the time of my birth, the laws changed. My father had to be a Japanese citizen.
Had to be a Japanese citizen.
Citizen, yes, my father. It's patrilineal through the father.
Right. Oh, and he wasn't. Right.
Yes.
Okay, I understand.
Only the father.
Right.
Whereas other countries, and then it changed during the late 70s and 80s because of outmarriage. I mean, Japanese women marrying non-Japanese citizens, so they could bestow a Japanese system matrilineal, through the mother.
Right.
Whereas there are other countries like Israel where it's mothers.
Mother's central. Mother, you're not even Jewish.
Right. That's correct. So it's very central.
That's
but
right.
the patrilineal is common in Confucian countries: South Korea, Taiwan, Japan.
Well, the U.S. is in Confucian, and isn't it?
It's
through
both.
The father?
Both.
It's both.
Both.
In the U.S.
From the beginning, and
beginning.
also you have U.S. citizenship through birth in the U.S.
Yeah. Right. Now, why are you so knowledgeable about this historical stuff? Really, because I can just sense that you really know the history behind everything you've gone through. A lot of people forget about all this.
I think that in order to understand what is happening today, we must understand how people dealt with life in the past, and also looking in the future, because we can't make the same mistakes. And I see people in the past, like my grandfather, who had never heard English, suddenly responding to a announcement or some recruiter coming to his town called Tamana in northern Kumamoto prefecture and saying, why not work in a sugar plantation in Hawaii? And he said, this sounds great.
Compared to what he had.
That's right.
Of course.
As a not as a first son. I think he was a third son.
And he knew he wasn't going to inherit anything.
Yes, nothing. So he was going to have nothing. So he left for Maui, and in 1899, and my grandmother followed as a picture bride. She had never met my grandfather. And then came 3 sons in succession.
Your father being?
1915.
No, but
the
second
second
son.
son.
Okay.
But he and his first son, 2 brothers, were brought up in Japan. And my grandmother brought up the 3rd son, and he was spoiled rotten.
Of course.
Because imagine if you're my grandmother and thinking that she'll never see her 2 sons again.
Right.
Yeah,
She wanted to
imagine.
keep
I mean,
one.
when they
She
left.
wanted to keep one.
Right. And he was spoiled. But he was also the most American because he never studied Japanese.
Okay.
And you're correct that my older uncle and my father were very close, living together in their uncle's home.
But they
in
were,
Kumamoto.
how many, were they just months apart?
About 3 years apart.
3 years
Yeah,
apart,
3
okay.
years.
And what about the youngest?
About 3 years, about 4 years.
From your
younger,
father?
My father, yes.
Oh, so
yes.
there's no way they would be close.
Yes. So my uncle, well, there's 3 brothers. Their names were Takeshi, Mareshi, Futoshi.
Okay.
But they had nicknames: Bill, Roy, Buster.
Of course.
Yeah,
Of
and
course.
both my uncle Bill and my father spoke Japanese to each other all the time because they were raised in Japan. The 3rd was very American. He could not speak Japanese at all. It was very pidgin or very dialect filled and so forth. But he was the one who went into the 442nd and won a Bronze Star north of Rome.
North of Rome?
Yes, he was north of the Arno River. Yes.
Which you don't think? Wait. Which war are we talking about? This is your.
Second World War II. Yeah.
This is your brother's.
This is my uncle, my father's younger brother.
Oh, your father's younger brother. Okay, I'm missing it. Okay.
So he's the one who was very American. But
wait, your father's younger brother, right?
Yes.
But you said your father was in the Korean War.
Yes, he was also in the U.S. military.
But he had to have been in World War II then.
Yes, exactly.
So he stated he was career.
Correct.
Military.
See what? Yes, okay. You're correct. That my uncle was discharged after the war immediately and went back to Maui. But my father, but you see, it's very nuanced how you look at things unless you're there. I asked my father how it was in a relocation camp in Arkansas, and he said, "Oh, in the beginning it was really great." Why is that? Well, he was a single man, young. He had 3 meals a day, and he met other Japanese speakers. And he had fun playing cards and hanging out and reading books. And he didn't have a family, right? He didn't have his mother or father going through all this. So he was kind of free-spirited. And I said, what happened? Well, he said the week after Pearl Harbor, he always had a 1A selective service. You know what that is. He's eligible for the draft at any time. Anytime. The board says come, you have to go.
You gotta go,
and you have to do your physical and your basic training. Well, he received a new card in the mail that said, a draft card that says, enemy alien ineligible for the draft. But he was born on Maui. He was a citizen of the U.S. But at that time, he said, well, that's okay.
This is in 42?
Yes, exactly, 1942. So he was in Arkansas. And then one day he got bored. And then he saw in the newspaper that the law had changed. By catch-22, the U.S. would not draft him as a Japanese American, but he could volunteer. It's a catch-22, right? And then he immediately volunteered. And I said, why did you do that? He said, well, I wanted to get out of the camp and just see things. And so where did he go? Well, he went to a training camp, a basic training camp called Camp Shelby in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, which was at that time the hometown of the University of Southern Mississippi, which was segregated. And so he arrived in this town and immediately saw that everything was the fountains, the buses, the movie house, completely segregated world. And he met my uncle, who was also going through basic training. And they said, we should have a photograph, a picture, before we get sent, fighting outside the U.S. So they tried to find a photography studio that will admit them. But they found it. They found one. And I still have that picture.
Just the two of them.
Yes. And
But they were an all Asian, all Japanese
Correct.
squadron. They could not be mixed.
But yes,
And they had a
but
very
they
special
could walk
paternal.
around Hattiesburg.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Or anywhere
At
else.
their own risk, yeah.
Yeah, but actually, they found the South, a very interesting place because it was quite different to Detroit, which was not that segregated. But of course, as you know, there was the great migration of African Americans coming from the South and working in Ford. And,
After World War II, particularly.
Huge, yeah.
Right.
But you could see the beginnings of that.
That's
but
right.
still, after the war, that would be great
It was
migration.
bigger. It was
Yeah.
from there and also to the west.
Right.
The East Coast, up north, and then to the west. Because my father was a part of that from
Right,
Louisiana.
yeah.
He was in World War II.
So again, you see the world and you want to go see, you want to live outside your hometown. So, and that's what happened. And, what happens to my father is interesting. And then he had two things that happened during World War II that saved his life. Number one, a Nisei or Japanese American officer came and said, if you speak and read Japanese, come with me to be trained as an interpreter or cryptologist or reader of documents. You get another stripe, more money, and it'll be a great time. My father thought about this, and he said, I'm better than anybody here. All the other Nisei could barely speak your Japanese because they grew up in Hawaii or Stockton or Seattle. But he had grown up in Japan. But he was very fluent in English. But he said, there's something fishy about this. But he didn't go. Years later, he's in Paris. Okay? This is another story. And he meets another Nisei. What happened to them? And many of them ended up in Burma, Guadalcanal,
Right.
Philippines, and it was really a bad situation, bad environment. Shot at by both sides. Both
right,
sides,
of
yeah.
course.
And so that happened. The second thing that happened to him was that the U.S. Army reviewed his background and said one day, do you know about cars? And my father says, yes. And they said, we're going to take you out of the infantry and put you in the quartermaster corps. And because we want you, and this was later in the war when France was liberated and Germany was ready to surrender, and he became a courier on the Autobahn in Munich, in post-war Germany, occupation Germany. And Stuttgart and Munich, he would ride the Autobahn because the Jeep broke, he had to fix it. There were no gas stations. Radiator broke, a tire change, he had to fix it. So he's in Munich, and all the Germans would come to the beer hall with him and whisper, Germany and Japan like this. And they bought him drinks, and he had a great time. And to this, before he passed away, some of his best, happiest times were in Austria and Germany.
Of course. How old was he when he passed?
In 2005, he was
2005,
90. Yeah,
90.
yeah.
Your mother?
She passed away young. She was barely 70 during a heart operation in the year 2000.
Okay.
Yeah, and she was born and raised in Hokkaido. Yeah, and we're very old residents of Hokkaido from Honshu, and as you know, Aomori, that was the area of the Matsumaya clan, who crossed the strait, Tsugaru Strait, to Hokkaido called Ezo in the early 18th century. And my ancestors came to Hokkaido and settled in a very small village called Kaminokuni next to a larger port called Esashi. North of Esashi was the line, was all Ainu.
I was just about to say that to you, because I was going to say, you could be Ainu.
Well,
Easily.
the joke is that we're part Russian.
Right,
The joke
part
is
Russian, right.
half joke. And because they're still doing sakoku during the time when Japan was was insular and nobody could travel out or people could come in. The only place that had some interaction with outsiders was Hokkaido. The Ainu were traveling to Sakhalin in the north, to Russia, trading furs and salmon. And Japanese, my ancestors, were fishing, and they must have, some of them, landed on the Russian area. And
But then all
came
those
back.
islands too. I mean, prior to that, all those islands were still Japanese control.
Correct. Yes.
They were all right up to Russia.
Yes, that's
basically,
right.
so-
And some of my relatives were in Karafuto, which is north of Japan. Half of that was Japanese until the end of the war,
Right.
and then the
Russia
Russians
took it.
invaded.
Right, exactly.
And even today, there are videos of Japanese graves and former temples in Sakhalin. Yeah.
Right. My goodness. So tell me, through school, okay, you're going through school. I'm going to get back to you
Yeah.
now. That was interesting about your father, though, because I'm very close to my father. You were very close to your father?
Yeah, I think though he regretted not wanting to be the auto engineer or mechanical that he always wanted to be. The war changed everything. You're right. So in that way, during the 60s also, Japan was growing, but he always thought that Japan would never develop a car industry. He was very.
He really thought that?
Oh, he was very American. He was all Ford. He was all
Ford,
Chrysler, GM.
yes.
He was very.
Of course. Well,
focused.
we were the dominant then.
Right,
dominant, so that's all you
and
could
there was
say.
nothing here during the early 60s. Things were just breaking up. So I also think what would have happened to me if I had not left for Hawaii in '65, because after '65 things changed dramatically within Japan. And then the 70s comes, and then suddenly 80s come, and there's the bubble, and Japan is center of the world. And I always wondered what would my career would have looked like. But I think in the end, I think I would have left for a U.S. College, university, probably in Hawaii, and would not have lived in Japan. But I'm always interested in the what ifs, what happens to
What ifs? So you really like history?
For example, I wrote a short essay for the Japan Times on the sinking of the Toyamaru. And the Toyamaru was a very innovative ship that went from Hakodate to Aomori all the time. And in 1951 or so,
What was its purpose?
it was just it was a ferry. It was a ferry.
A ferry.
In those days, as you know, until the tunnel was made, the Seikan Tunnel, and of course there's millions of flights from Haneda to Sapporo. The only way to go to Hokkaido was to go to Ueno Station, get on a sleeper train that goes to Aomori, and then you get on a ferry to Hakodate, and then another train to Sapporo. There's a long journey.
Right.
And my father was supposed to go to Hachinohe and to get on the ferry called the Toyamaru. And it was early September, and for some reason he didn't get on the ship, and then the ship sank in a typhoon. And if you look at the records, it's one of the more than nearly 2,000 people, at least 1,500 passed away on that ship. It was loaded with people, including soldiers from the 1st Cavalry Division at that time, the Korean War. And I think what had happened is that my mother was pregnant with me. And if my father had lost, what would have happened to my life? That I would be in Hokkaido, still a U.S. citizen, but having a very local Hokkaido, Chitose, Inaka country kind of upbringing. That's another whole trajectory that I missed because my father missed that ship and we went to Hawaii. But he had retired by the time I was in 2nd, 3rd grade.
Oh, really?
Yes.
So what did he start doing? What kind of work did your father
Well,
do?
he had a hard time adjusting to life after the military. And in Hawaii, he worked in a warehouse part of Hickam Air Force Base.
Okay.
So that's what he did. Yeah.
Right. Your father stayed in for what, 20 years?
Yes, he retired.
Because I think that was all they allowed you at that time. 20 years. So what did your interest start to develop into from elementary? Were you more academic or were you more sports-minded?
No, I was more academic. I was always interested in writing and literature and English and so forth. But my first degree, bachelor's, during the early mid-'70s, when you think back in the '70s, was in ethnic studies.
Okay, but you didn't get involved in sports, or you had to do some sort of sports
Yeah,
activities.
a little bit,
but you weren't
not
interested.
Not much in high school because I was surrounded by Hawaiians and Samoans who were very good in football, much bigger. And I grew up in an area called Kalihi, Palama in Honolulu. It's a district adjacent to downtown. It used to be more Japanese back then. It's predominantly Filipino and Pacific Islander and immigrants today. Well, I think the area where I grew up was very ethnically diverse.
In Hawaii?
Maybe, yeah, in Hawaii, which is very unique in Kalihi Palama. Always made me never judge, this is a silly, book by its cover. Always ask questions. How do they see the world that is different than yours? And to adjust the way I speak to that person so that person understands me and my background in the context of their world.
That's interesting. When did you start to develop that?
I think in school, you know, as a way to, you know, make friends and sustain friends, and what was interesting is that during my 20 years in Tokyo, I did a lot of work in Japan, of course, the gaishikei, foreign companies in Japan, but also I did work in emerging markets, which means places like Greater China, India, Southeast Asia. I even went to South Africa, Brazil, Russia, and other parts of the world. And I think I could deal with other people in an effective way because I wanted to learn about them. And people love to tell other people about themselves. They loved hearing questions. And so that's what I did. And also the word respect. And because I'm curious, you know, and they would say, oh, that's the. I'll give you an example. In southern India, it's quite different than northern India. Many languages there in southern India, whereas in the north, Hindi predominates. And I learned about this in Chennai, which was called Madras in southern India, and I learned a little bit about their Tamil language. And then I spoke it to some greetings there in a hotel, and they were overwhelmed because they thought that foreigners thought that only Indian people speak Hindi. And they were just overwhelmed that a person would study about it. And same thing like South Africa. I went there and found out that many people speak many languages, isiXhosa, isiZulu, and so forth. And Kunjani is a greeting. And that was a very powerful way of just connecting with people. That I knew that they weren't dominant in one group. There were many groups because there are codes. They would, you know, and so if I meet a person from India today and ask them where they're from, and they may say Mumbai, and I say, oh, are you a Marathi speaker? Are you Gujarati? If they're from Bangalore, if they speak Kannada or their home language, and maybe some Telugu or Tamil, and they say, oh, yes, yeah.
Right, you're right in there. Right?
Yeah, and they say, you understand my family and so forth. And then from there, I think we have something in common, and then we can go beyond that because now they know that I understand the context of their family, and there's a code word that they use, their community, which is caste or whatever in India, and language, and many times in Shandi.com, which is a website for marriages, you always see lines. They must speak the language. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, and of course their community and so forth. But the language is because they need a partner who can communicate to their parents. Yeah, see,
that's
extended
right,
family. Yeah, yeah.
Because that's very important.
That's right.
In
yeah.
their
So
caste system,
it's a long story, but Kalihi Palama is where I grew up. But I leveraged what I learned interacting with people globally.
That's why you graduated with a degree in
Yeah.
ethnic studies, which most people would think you're not going to make much money with that type of degree because that's what people would think at that time.
Well, today, what is the
words
in major corporate Fortune 250 companies? Diversity.
Diversity, right.
Inclusiveness. Yes.
Right.
And collaboration.
Right.
And across borders. Intra-company, inter-company partnerships. These are words that every CEO is using today.
That's right. That's so true. My goodness. So where do you see yourself today? What's your life like now? Your daughter being 30 years old
33,
now,
yeah. So
and
we
a
live
lawyer.
together. We live together.
Oh, she lives with you? Well, what about your wife?
We live all together with
Okay.
my son-in-law, my daughter, and my grandchild.
Oh, that is beautiful.
So that's a new life for us. But many families are intergenerational in Hawaii because of work inflexibility. My daughter is now a year and 5 months, and she's Japanese on her mother's side, and a lot of Portuguese
She's
on
a
her.
year and 5. Your daughter, your granddaughter.
My granddaughter, yes,
Okay.
my granddaughter, yeah. So on a baby, and so so we take care of that, but I always wanted to come back, partly to see old friends in Tokyo. But on Friday, I'm going to Sapporo to see to do in Japanese ohaka mairi, which is to pay respects to our
ancestors.
family grave on my mother's side. And I have many cousins in Sapporo, and we're getting together. During COVID, of course, I've lost several uncles, but I could not go to the funeral. So that's my other goal this time.
Mm-hmm. Do you speak many languages?
No, I just speak Japanese and English, and that's the way I was brought up because my father and mother spoke Japanese at home all the time.
Right. Yeah. And they made sure you did that. Before I end the podcast, Reed, there's always a question I like to ask everyone. And if you've watched any of them, you probably know what it is. If you could magically go back in time and meet the younger Ray and give him advice, knowing what you know now, how old would that Ray be, and what type of advice would you give him?
I would go back to when I was 10 years old in Japan, and really young Ray, I guess, and tell that boy that you can take great risks in life, but you have to work at it to achieve those. And I think I would not change anything because I think I'm bound by fate in a Buddhist kind of way. But on the other hand, my life has been tied as a bridge between Japan and the US and especially Hawaii. But when I think of risk, imagine what risk my grandparents took. Leaving Japan and their families and all their friends and education and language to Hawaii. And I said, there was no information back then. There was no internet. There was no TV or radio. And they took, both of them never returned to Japan once. They spent their entire life in Hawaii. Yeah. But again, I think they were very happy doing that in the end. But of course, I can't really say that they were because I didn't ask that question. I think, though, in my own life, one thing I've learned is that you have children, I have one child, that your children are, of course, different people. But you think that they're like you.
Parts of them.
Yeah,
Parts of them are.
yeah.
It's past
But
time,
I think you feel that they're more part of you than they are. But I think looking back, I think we did a good job because we always felt the objective of being a child is to be happy. That's it.
Well, obviously your daughter's very happy. She's living with you. She's living with you, and I'm sure you are too. You are too.
Well, thank you very much.
I want to thank you so much, Ryan.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I want to thank all of you for watching this podcast. Make sure you press like and subscribe. And never forget, it's all on loan. So continue to reach for the stars.
Because you're too blessed to be stressed.